Alrighty, balloon mania has taken over the United States. People are raving about the Chinese weather balloon. Congrats everyone, it's Free Balloon Day. And I have to say, when a story like this comes along that just instantly captivates the whole of the country, there's nothing more that I want to do than ignore it. Because there's so many people talking about it, there is nothing that I can add by bringing it up. And so I will not mention things like this on my channel. But there is an exception in this case. Free Balloon Day is not necessarily all that it seems. What we're told is that the Chinese are flying their weather balloon across the U.S. It's on a global journey. It apparently just drifted into our airspace. Just happens to be drifting over, nuclear silos. And this is all very bad. So currently, the debate in the United States is over, should we shoot down the balloon? Should we let the balloon go? How should we respond to this act of Chinese aggression? And I have no interest in participating in that. Really doesn't matter to me one way or the other. But I do feel that I should point out there is a third possibility here. There's a third thing that we could be arguing over. And to me, the third point is a question. It's a question that needs to be asked, given the history of all involved parties. Could this just be a psyop? There was a recent report that an Air Force general, who I think is in charge of like the refueling planes, that's like his beat, he feels that the U.S. is going to be at war with China by 2025. We've been hearing more and more in the media about Taiwan and how we must protect it. The great noble Taiwanese democracy must never fall. The Taiwanese people are the best that the human race has to offer. They're basically Ukrainians with slanted eyes. And essentially setting up the premise that Taiwan, if attacked by China, should be defended with the full force of the United States military. There have been people sort of in the shadows, but now more and more publicly, for the last couple of years, pushing this idea. And this little weather balloon blowing across the American heartland fits very well into that narrative. This balloon shows that the Chinese are not just interested in what's going on in Asia. This is not some Chinese spy balloon flying over Taiwan. No, this is flying over Montana. It's flying over Nebraska. It'll probably be flying over the East Coast at some point. This is a spy balloon, we're told, that has journeyed across America, trying to gather as much information on us and our weaknesses as possible. And the obvious implication being that China sees us as the enemy, and they're going to attack us. Now, I'm not disputing necessarily the idea that this balloon indeed did come from China. I'm also not disputing that this balloon is probably gathering intelligence on the United States. But I do think that this balloon does more to help the United States' narrative and help the U.S.'s effort than it ever could help the Chinese. Because this is one of those things that just sticks in the minds of people. It is a part of the escalation, the build-up to a new war, and ultimately gets people in the mindset of being closer and closer to accepting the inevitability of a military confrontation between the United States and China, a confrontation that we surely would not survive. So this just doesn't sit well with me. I don't, like I said, I don't think that this is necessarily like a balloon that was deployed by the U.S. because the Chinese are not denying that this balloon is theirs. They have confirmed that it was they who launched it. And in order to believe that this was planned by the U.S. to begin with, I think that you would have to assume that there is some level of coordination between the Chinese and the Americans on trying to ratchet up tensions, which would be very hard to rationalize. Why would they mutually want to ratchet up tensions between the two of them? Why would they, work together in planning something? The closest that I'm willing to go to saying that this was a setup is to say that perhaps the Psyop is the U.S. not shooting it down. Because presumably, the U.S. has been tracking this balloon the whole time. If it's visible to the naked eye, apparently, or something like that, or we have pictures of it, it's on, it's on flight radar and all this. The balloon is not very well concealed. And so as soon as, NORAD or whoever's in charge of this saw this balloon coming close, they could have, scrambled some jets, popped the balloon, and, recovered it before it gathered any intelligence, before it looked at any of the missile silos or whatever it is they're trying to take pictures of or record. And this all could have been kept under wraps. Nobody would have ever known. China's little balloon wouldn't have done them any good. Nobody, the public, would be none the wiser. That's typically the way the U.S. government likes to play everything. They like to keep everything a secret. But this, for some reason, is very public. It's very open. Everybody's talking about the Chinese spy balloon. And the balloon's not being shot down. So perhaps that's the aim here. Perhaps they're trying to let it sink in for people that, hey, China's a threat. Look at what they're doing. They're flying over our heads now. China could be dropping bombs if they wanted to tomorrow. And so you should be afraid of them. Now, I'm just thinking out loud here. That's why I'm kind of talking slow, especially the last couple of days. Because I'm thinking through my words before I say them. I don't do scripts. I don't plan things out. I don't do notes. I used to, like the first year maybe of this channel, I would scratch down maybe a couple of bullet points that I wanted to cover, but then I would never look at them anyway, which is why I quit doing it. And honestly, just something in me kind of snapped when I saw the Chinese response, and they said, "Oh, well, it's a weather balloon." And it gave me Roswell flashbacks. It's like, oh my gosh, Xi has learned his gaslighting from watching old History Channel shows. It was just, it seemed like a joke. They couldn't expect anybody to believe that it was a weather balloon, given the history of weather balloons in American popular culture and government secrets. And so perhaps the Chinese deployed this spy balloon as a trial balloon, knowing it would be shot down. That's why they call them trial balloons. You float a trial balloon over the enemy to see if they'll shoot it, so that you kind of can get the enemy to expose themselves. I think that's the purpose of trial balloons. And instead of just shooting down this trial balloon, the U.S. pointed out, hey, this trial balloon, it exists, or at least they allowed people to find out that it exists and then didn't deny it. And they're just letting it go by, and they're letting it linger. And they're letting this Chinese presence hang over all of America. Today, people across the country are looking up in the sky wondering if there's a Chinese man looking down at them. And I can't imagine that the reason why that is because the Biden administration is just too cowardly to shoot down a Chinese balloon that's over American airspace. It's just silly. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that Biden said that the U.S. would defend Taiwan with military force. So this is not an administration that is so deathly afraid of China that they wouldn't shoot down a Chinese balloon that has crossed into American airspace, unauthorized. And so be careful not to get swept up in the anti-China hysteria. Now, I'm not saying the Chinese are good guys, by no means. I'm no fans of them. I'm no more fan of the Chinese than I've ever been, as far as the government's concerned. Obviously, Chinese food is fine. Chinese government, not so much. And so people aren't wrong to dislike it. But to see them as a direct threat to the U.S., to see China as, this is our next enemy that we got to take on. These are just the next people that we have to go to war with because that's the way things go. That's the attitude you got to be careful of, because people were so conditioned before the Iraq War to believe Saddam Hussein was the enemy. They had conflated, 9/11 and all these things together, and somehow everything was Saddam Hussein's fault. It's just things keep getting more and more risky. Every new war is a bigger threat to the human race than the previous war. Back in the day, we had Iraq and Afghanistan. The U.S. was just, playing by itself, in a sandbox with its new toys. And sure, they killed lots of civilians, but it was not a threat. It could not lead to a nuclear holocaust, we'll put it that way. Then the U.S. wanted to play in the Syrian sandbox, but that was Russia's sandbox. Russia was already playing there. It was occupied. And if you had American pilots and Russian pilots in the air shooting at each other, things could get real bad real quick. And so people were concerned back then, hey, this war in Syria, if the U.S. gets too involved, could lead to nuclear war. Now, of course, we have Ukraine, right on Russia's border. It's a former Soviet Socialist republic that Russia is at war with. And the U.S. and the rest of the West has gone all in on siding with Ukraine. And again, we're too close for comfort to a nuclear holocaust. But we're not as close as we would be if we were at war with China. First, we were talking about going to war with a bunch of tribesmen living in teepees. They don't have nukes. There could be some blowback, sure, and there was a lot of blowback, but no nukes. Then they were talking about, hey, let's play in the same sandbox as these other guys who have nukes. Then it became, hey, why don't we do everything except send boots on the ground to help aside fighting a war against guys with nukes? The next step after that is let's just directly go to war with the guys who've got nukes. American soldiers storming Chinese beaches. Or even just American soldiers fighting to keep the Chinese soldiers from landing on Taiwanese beaches. Remember that the Chinese consider Taiwan to be part of their territory. And so therefore, if you have, Americans sending troops to Taiwan to reinforce it, to defend against an impending Chinese invasion, well, the Chinese will consider that an American invasion of Chinese sovereign territory. And that certainly, if that doesn't justify the deployment of nuclear weapons for a nuclear power, I don't know what would. If there were Chinese amphibious vehicles landing on the beaches of California or Alaska, do you not think that the U.S. would have their finger on the button? Do you not think that the U.S. might even fire a warning shot. I know that if I were Chinese, I would not want my government to take that chance. You can say, oh, well, maybe not. Well, the U.S. wouldn't, they wouldn't nuke China. Just over that, the U.S. would just defeat the troops, that are landing on the beach. They would just, they'd just level them. They'd fire conventional missiles at their boats, sink their invasion force. Okay, sure, but what if that didn't work? What if the Chinese invasion was actually successful? What if they started taking over territory? What if they conquered California? I'd be fine with that personally, because they can't do worse than the present California government. But that aside, the President of the United States, if there's a foreign invasion of the American homeland, as we call it, even if it was just Hawaii, maybe that's more analogous. You say Hawaii because that's an island like Taiwan that the U.S. considers to be its sovereign territory. You think America would just let the Chinese take Hawaii if they wanted to? The U.S. got into World War II over defending Hawaii. Hawaii was not even a state. It was thousands of miles from any American settlement. Hawaii was just a parking lot for the U.S. Navy. It was a safe harbor in a rough neighborhood that one day, December 7th, 1941, was no longer a safe harbor. It became a very dangerous harbor. And after the conclusion of that war, a war that the U.S. got into over a Japanese attack on a small island that was not even a state, it was just a territory. The conclusion of that war ended with the dissolution of the Japanese Empire. Japan is a shadow of its former self. It's an American puppet state. It essentially has not existed in any real sense since 1945. All over some island that's much smaller, far less inhabited, and certainly far less important to the American people than Taiwan is to the people of China. Taiwan's a massive island. It's a big island. They've got a very sizable economy. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that the Chinese would just, march all over the United States and dismantle us the way that the U.S. dismantled Japan. Obviously, that war ended with the beginning of the atomic era. That war ended with nuclear weapons being deployed. In a U.S.-China conflict, the deployment of nuclear weapons would not come after a long 4-year campaign. It would not come on the eve of, the defeat of one party when one side is just barely hanging on and they've lost most of their territory that has been conquered by the other side. No, the nukes would be preemptive, depending on how you want to use that term. They would be used in the way of, escalating to de-escalate. You'd see one fired off at the other side. It would do its damage, probably hitting in a largely uninhabited area, just to send a message. And at that point, both sides would pause, and they would consider the gravity of the situation. And hopefully, they would stop. But that's a best case scenario. What's more likely to happen is that, as we've always feared, in a war between two nuclear powers, which are facing an existential crisis, both sides will have to resort to using nuclear weapons to have any hope of defeating the other side. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.